What's up, everybody? We have 10 minutes here with Mr. Nick Laufenberg across the table from us, and every time Nick joins us, we're pretty much going to talk about precision rifle stuff, long-range stuff, and making yourself a bit more informed of a shooter out there on the range. And today, we're going to talk about just a annoying little thing that we all have to deal with called wind.
Yes, sir.
And so, Nick, I think one of the things that I've found when I talk to really experienced shooters is, you know, I'll tend to go out there on the range. I'll send a round downrange, see what happens, and, you know, the left, right, that's kind of my first round is my indication of what maybe the wind is doing. Then I make my correction from there. It's not wrong, but it's also not exactly like, let's say you're in some sort of a competition atmosphere where that first round hit really makes a difference, or we were even discussing too, it does make a big difference in hunting a lot of times. And so the really good shooters out there, they have the ability to just understand what's going on with the wind, it seems. And not that they're God, they know exactly what's happening everywhere downrange, but they have a better idea of it just based on things that they can read, experience that they have, seeing certain things that might mean wind is, you know, there's different thermals going on, different wind directions as you go downrange at these longer range shots, and they have a higher chance of getting that first round hit.
Yeah.
And so what are some of those things that they're doing? How can somebody improve their chances of accurately understanding what's going to happen to their bullet to get that first round hit?
Yeah, so wind is, I would say, by far the most difficult part about long-range precision shooting. And a lot of that's because elevation, we can dial our turrets, we can hold over very accurately, very repeatably, but with wind, there's a lot more of artwork involved. You can really weed out the more experienced shooter based on how well that they can read wind and how well that they can make an accurate first round shot just by being able to predict what's happening. And that's because that comes with experience. You could go out there and get lucky in your first try, but you have to have experience over and over and over to see, okay, that's what this is, this is happening, so this must be happening downrange further too. So getting that first round hit on target is often very crucial, whether it be hunting or competition. So being able to get a good handle on what is probably happening as opposed to what exactly is happening. So I'll kind of go into a little bit more detail too. So I like to imagine wind flow very similar to like the flow of a river or a creek.
Yeah.
You have a primary direction that the water's flowing. But if you get down closer, you look at all the rocks, you look at all the pebbles in the river, you'll see that it'll change direction slightly. And depending on what type of object it's going around, it'll actually pick up or decrease its speed. Wind flows very similarly. You can use apps like, I use Windy, it's W-I-N-D-Y. I use that app to determine what the general direction of the wind is in my area. And that'll change throughout the day, but you can pick up your app, look at it real quick. Okay, let's go in this direction.
How does it know that? Does it?
It uses weather mapping.
Oh, okay. Our weather maps have wind directions too?
Yep.
I guess maybe that was a really dumb question. I just don't look at weather maps that often.
Well, you pull up, let's say you pull up weather.com app, and it'll say that you have a 8 to 10 mile per hour northeast wind. Yeah. It does that, but on a more finite scale, so you can zoom into your area on the map, and it'll actually show the pattern that the wind is flowing around.
Oh, okay, cool.
That's
So when you think like the apps that we check for like hunting, Jim, stuff like that, you get a lot of that same information.
Wind?
Yeah, wind direction.
Oh yeah.
Well, now I feel like a complete moron.
Well, wind
living in the dark ages.
You haven't been checking that, Jim?
No, I just throw some grass in the air and see where it.
Well, hey, speaking of that though, and Nick was just talking about wind behaving like water, and if you're a whitetail hunter and you've ever dropped milkweed, and actually I'd say would be a great experiment for any long range shooter as well. You drop some milkweed and you can see all those subtle things that Nick was talking about. Like it's heading for a tree and it speeds up as it goes around or whatever. It's very, very interesting how it behaves just like water.
It is. And if you have, and you're in a place with big rolling hills, you'll see that a lot. You might have a wind blowing straight from behind you, but if you do that, milkweed tester in the air, you might see it go left. And then as it approaches a hill, it'll quickly go right to go around the hill. But at that point, it's actually speeding up and changing direction too. So you have your primary wind, which is where your general direction, like the flowing of the river, and then you have your secondary winds, which is what's happening closer to the ground.
Yeah.
So that's when you start talking about wind gradients. That's kind of where that's coming into play. So the wind closer to the ground is different than the wind up above the ground.
Right.
And in gradients, it'll go up and up until you hit that primary direction.
Oh man. And I suppose if you're shooting a long enough shot and you're having to use enough elevation where you're arcing that bullet pretty high up in the air, you can almost play into different gradients. Is that a thing?
Oh yeah. A lot of guys actually doing like super ELR.
Yeah.
They will primarily look at the windy app or something like that to get your primary wind direction, because it gets up so high in the air that you're going to be hanging out in that wind for most of the flight.
Interesting.
Wild.
Wow.
I had never thought about it like that.
Yeah.
So you're using something like that to get you a baseline, but then you also have to go in and reference things like, I mean, I know we talked about it in a podcast before, but something as simple as tall grass between you and the target blowing one way, or I know then people read mirage a lot, and that's more of those indications, your own little milkweed-esque indicators downrange that are telling you how the wind is behaving flowing around certain elevation changes. Or
so I like to get my baseline with something like that windy app, and then I'll use a weather meter, or just throwing some milkweed in there, some grass, whatever it is, so that I can see what the wind direction is where I'm sitting.
Yeah.
So I'll look at that, and then I'll look downrange, look at the grass, look at the vegetation, look at the trees all downrange, see what direction they're blowing. Because wind direction is, I think, one of the more overlooked things when we're talking about wind and plugging that into a precision rifle shot. So if we know the wind direction, then the second thing we need to look at is the speed. And the speed goes up and down. It'll lull, it'll gust. It very rarely hangs out as an average. That's a big mistake I think a lot of guys make, is they look at, okay, well, I got a 10 mile per hour at the top end and a 2 mile per hour at the bottom end, and then they just average it, and that's what they hold.
Okay.
That's okay if you want to take a shot and get it in the ballpark and get a second round hit. It's not ideal, though, if you are trying to get a first round hit.
Yeah.
So identifying whether it's a gusty day or a lully day. So if I see that it's like blowing really hard for like 3-4 seconds, and then it drops down and lulls for a second, and then it speeds back up and gusts hard for 5 seconds, I know it's a gusty day, and the chances are that when I pull the trigger, it's going to be during a gust.
Okay.
So even if it lulls when I pull the trigger initially, the chances are that by the time the bullet gets to the target, it's going to be spending a lot of time in a gust, and it might be gusting at a different point. Like as soon as I pull the trigger here, it might go 10 feet and it's in a gust zone. So, So I want to look at that gust more than I would the lull.
It is really hard to look at wind in its individual little bubbles. Like you said, somebody might say, I've got a 5 degree or I've got a 5 mile an hour wind in my Kestrel wind meter here that I'm holding at the gun. And then they just think like, well, it's 5 mile an hour wind today. And then that's kind of just is what it is. Or the fact that, well, it's 5 miles an hour at the muzzle, so this whole area is 5 mile an hour wind. It's really, you don't need to move much to potentially end up in a completely different scenario.
Correct. Well, and to that point too, and a lot of guys do this when they're shooting in competitions and stuff, is they'll come off the line knowing what they actually held for wind, and then they'll put decrease and increase the wind value until their hold equals that amount, and then they can continue using that throughout the day. It doesn't mean that, let's say that ends up at 5 miles per hour. It doesn't mean that it's actually a 5 mile per hour wind all the way from point A to point B. It means that through all the directional changes, through all the velocity changes in the wind, from the point, from the shooter to the target, that it equates out to essentially a 5 mile per hour.
It's kind of like a validated average.
Yep, that's like what it kind of comes out to.
The net effect of everything.
Yeah, the net effect would be a good way of saying it, yeah.
Man, that's pretty wild. I was anticipating you to come on here and be like, yeah, I've heard some people, they talk about bringing in the parallax on their scope. You change the focus a little bit. You focus in on different ranges, downrange. You see what the mirage is doing at different distances. I'm like, tell us a little bit about that. Tell us a little bit about grass blowing around. But I mean, really, when you dive deep into wind, it's
a tricky subject, and it's definitely the hardest part about precision rifle shooting. I think it's the easiest thing to get beat by is the wind. Besides maybe the shooter themselves, not having enough confidence in their abilities, not training enough. The shooter kind of beats themselves down all the time, but that kind of goes into wind as well. Not training to shoot in the wind is one of the reasons why a lot of people fail right out the gate.
Are you better, you're talking about that gusty day, which, happens quite a bit, right? Are you better as a shooter to, if you have the option to wait to shoot in that lull, or does it just not matter? Like when are you going to try and break that shot?
In a perfect world, you would find out whether it's a gusty or a lully day, and then wait for that gust or that lull. But the truth of the matter is, there's a lot of different things happening between you and the target, and even if you're waiting for a lull and you pull the trigger, again, 5 feet down the range, you might have a gust zone,
right?
Yeah,
and then it might be gusty the entire way. So. Yeah, I mean, if everything was always the same from point A to point B, waiting for that lull or waiting for that gust is going to be perfect. It's going to be beneficial. But the chances of it doing the same thing at where you're shooting versus everything happening downrange is pretty low.
I feel like maybe if there's some chance that the gust is strong enough that it could mess with your just fundamentals of marksmanship, then you wait for that. But otherwise, to your point, it's kind of like, well, you waited for this lull here, but then a gust picked up a little bit down. So, and it is, speaking of fundamentals of marksmanship, I feel like this is also, you can understand everything in the world about wind, but if you're not a good shot and you don't actually execute a really good shot that you're confident in, that's another area where you can start to mess yourself up pretty good. And because there's nothing worse than taking a shot that you pulled a little bit, or that you flinched a little bit, or you weren't totally comfortable and set in natural point of aim, blah blah. There's nothing worse than taking that shot and you're like, oh, I know that wasn't right, and then you miss, and you're thinking, well, maybe I'm good enough to call that I felt I pushed that left. But how much of it was me and how much of it was wind?
Right.
And then how do you make a correction accurately based on that? Whereas if you can execute a good, consistent shot every time, then you at least know whatever error happened downrange was because of wind or something else.
Right. Yeah, you kind of alleviate or some of those variables, or can take them out of the equation and make that accurate adjustment. I was going to say one thing that I experienced one time, and I think I talked about this in one of our other long-range podcasts, but it was an experience that stood out to me, Jim, was I was shooting at 1,000 yards from a location where, like, there was a physical barrier, right, that was blocking the wind. And we've talked in the past about, like, the wind at your location is probably one of the more critical wind components. But there was no wind at my location because I was being blocked by something, not thinking about that. And then the second that bullet got past that barrier, it was being affected by wind all the way down. And I wasn't, as Scott Parks likes to say, trust the bullet. I wasn't trusting the bullet because I was like, there's no wind. Like, what's going on? And so I missed in the same spot 3 times in a row.
Yeah, that's there is, so that's one of the reasons why I really dislike the blanketing statements of, like, the wind at the shooter is the most important, which it is, because it in the process and mathematically, the wind at the shooter is the most important, because if the bullet is changed in its trajectory at the muzzle, it'll be changed on that trajectory for the entire flight of the target, or until it's redirected.
Right.
So yes, at the muzzle, that is the immediate effect on the bullet. However, if, like you said, if you sit in there and you are taking out your Kestrel and says, well, I got a 2 mile per hour wind, but 30 feet down the range and on a 1,000 yard shot, then you get a 15 mile per hour wind. Well, that probably wasn't the best call. So being able to look downrange further and see what's happening. You talked about rolling your parallax and looking at mirage. I don't like to use mirage for wind speed. It's an okay way to kind of get kind of a swag answer, but you're not going to be able to get as precise, because the the existence of sunlight or the intensity of the sunlight will change what the mirage looks like. The backdrop will change what the mirage looks like. The density of the air will change what the mirage looks like.
I mean, yeah, you're trying to use an optical illusion to get an accurate measurement.
Yeah. So, I mean, there is some truth to, you know, whether the mirage is tipped fully sideways or at an angle or boiling straight up. That's true. I use the boil in the mirage often to find wind direction if I'm looking at a boil.
What is a boil?
So that is if you're looking downrange rather than you see mirage shimmer off to the left or right, you're seeing it just shimmering straight up. And that means that there is a zero wind valley pointed in that direction.
Okay.
So either it means that that is the direction the wind is coming from or there is no wind that day.
Oh, sure. Okay. I was going to ask, we've been talking about, I guess, wind in a lot of ways from kind of like a left, right, or like a directional, but what about like an up or down draft?
The process of like thermals. I actually was just watching the one you guys talked with Seth Toy about about what was it? You're talking about mirage.
We're talking about mirage.
Yeah. So he had mentioned thermals in there, and I'm not as read up on thermals as I probably should be. I don't think that it plays a large enough factor to be a part of my process right now. But wind as a component to how it affects a bullet is not just a left and right thing.
Right.
So if you're taking a super long range shot and you have a wind from behind you and it's going uphill, that wind is being deflected underneath the bullet. And it's actually going to be affecting the bullet in a upward fashion. So you're going to hit higher if you have a wind from underneath.
Or like many people do, they shoot off of a high point on the edge of a hill or a cliff or something, and if the wind is blowing at them, it's hitting that hill and then coming up.
Yep.
You get that bit of jump immediately.
It's the same thing with how water flows. If you have a large rock in the river, it's going to flow up and around that rock, and it's going to change its direction. That can be an upward direction too.
Yeah. Good point, Mark.
So one other thing, and I know we don't want to run over, but if you were talking about getting the first round hit, it's important to know the size of your target. So if I know that I have a 12-inch target, I'm a lung shooter when it comes to deer. I like to eat the heart. I don't like to destroy that piece of meat. So I know that I have, about a 9-10-inch target, probably?
Yeah.
So something like that. So I use that when I factor in my wind drift. If I know that I have, at that range, I'm going to use it in inches, even though I don't like to. Let's say that I have, going to have at least 4 inches of wind drift. Okay, and let's say I'm working with an 8-inch target. I'm going to hold on the left or right, whichever direction the wind's coming from, of that target. So if I know where the lungs are, I'm going to bracket on that edge of the lungs so that I know that if the wind lulls out, I'm going to still hit the lungs on that side of the target. If it picks up, it's going to hit center. If I have a massive gust, it's going to hit the left side of it. So I'm just increasing my percentage of hit. So using the size of the target to your advantage is always a good way to increase your hit percentage.
Because, I mean, like you said, hitting a lung is hitting a lung. And also, when you hit steel, you hit steel. It doesn't matter if you wind up hitting it out towards the side.
Correct.
Or right in the middle.
Yep.
That's a good point.
I got one more question.
Mark, you've been trying to take us past our 20-minute death zone.
we're gonna stay under.
Let's go. All right.
Well, you're the one that's stalling. So okay, this is on average, right? So and from like a hunting perspective, or even just a target shooting perspective, with most, I guess, cartridges that we're gonna say are being used, like your 6.5 Creeds, your 308s, your 300s, 270s, 06s, and we'll pick an average day. We'll say like a 5 to 10 mile an hour wind. We'll make it easy. We'll do like a full, right or left crosswind, right? At what distance does that wind become like really, really critical where you need to start thinking about it?
If we're talking about a 10 mile per hour wind, I would say that just in the interest of being precise with my shooting, I would say I'm starting to really pay attention past about 250 yards.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah,
that's a little bit closer than I thought.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I was thinking. I mean, think about shooting at 3, though. Like, it's easy enough to miss at 3 on a small enough target.
Yeah.
When wind kicks
but if
up.
you're talking about precision.
And I do, even if I'm working with a big target, there's a very small area of that target I'm trying to hit.
Right.
And wind can be really tricky. We talked about gusts and lulls. I'm trying to decrease my percentage of error as much as I can when I pull the trigger. So knowing that, at that range, I mean, even if you're doing low development and you're shooting at 100 yards and you got a 10 mile per hour full value wind, you're going to see horizontal stringing. It might not be dramatic, but it's enough to frustrate you for trying to shoot a tiny group. Well, you expand that over 250, 300, 400 yards. That vertical stringing can be enough to, if you screwed up with your shot, maybe you're not in a very stable shooting position. Your error percentage is increasing already. So you got to decrease that error percentage by removing all variables you can, or at least finiting them out to a smaller variable.
Mark, that's the second time that you've done this now. We're all dead. We're all dead.
Ryan, he'll trim out some gaps, and you're the one that we'd be under if you hadn't have, talked about me going long.
No. Anyway, we do appreciate all of you sticking it out with us, even though we've gone over 20 minutes on this one a bit. But hey, wind deserves quite a lot of conversation. Nick, thank you for joining us.
Anytime.
If anybody has any other comments or questions about wind and other things, let us know in the comments below if you're watching on YouTube. Also on Instagram at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'll see you on the next one if we're still around.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Bye.
Nick.
Bye.